The small town of Ashford prided itself on its low crime rate, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. That's why, when Thomas Grayson was arrested for the brutal murder of 3 women, the town was in shock. Not because of the crime itself, but because Thomas Grayson had never existed. Detective Laura Pierce had seen some strange cases in her 15 years with the Ashford Police Department, but nothing like this. When the fingerprints came back from the latest crime scene, they belonged to a man with no history, no birth certificate, no social security number, no driver's license. It was as if Thomas Grayson had been born the day he was arrested. Hold on, if you like the true crime documentary story you are watching now, subscribe to the channel for more updates, thank you. The murders had started 6 months prior. 3 women, all found in their homes, their throats slit with surgical precision. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA. The town was on edge. Then, a break in the case, CCTV footage from a nearby gas station the night before the 3rd murder. A man, tall and lean, his face partially obscured by a hood. He bought a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, paying in cash. The cashier remembered his voice. Calm. Too calm, she had told the police. When detectives ran the footage through facial recognition, they found a match, a man named Thomas Grayson, living in a modest rental home on the outskirts of town. It seemed too easy. Laura and her team raided the house the next morning. They expected to find a suspect. What they found instead sent a chill down their spines. The house was immaculate. No clutter, no personal belongings, just a mattress on the floor and a single chair in the living room. No pictures, no mail, no sign that anyone had ever truly lived there. Thomas was sitting in the chair, waiting for them. He didn't resist when they cuffed him. He didn't even blink. Back at the station, Thomas answered every question with eerie calmness. Yes, he lived in Ashford. No, he didn't have a job. Yes, he knew the women who had died. But when Laura asked him how, he simply smiled and said, "I've always known them." Fingerprints confirmed that the man they had in custody was at each crime scene. But there was something off. When they ran his prints through national databases, they didn't just come back empty, they returned an error. As if he wasn't real. His DNA was no help either. The lab technicians said it didn't match anything on record. No relatives, no criminal history, nothing. Laura dug deeper. If Thomas Grayson had no past, where did he come from? She started with the landlord of his rental home, an older woman named Martha Nolan. Martha was hesitant at first, but then she admitted something strange. Thomas had paid his rent in cash for 3 years. No lease, no ID. He had simply walked in one day and asked if the house was available. 3 years. That meant he had been in Ashford long before the murders began. Laura visited the grocery store where he supposedly shopped. The cashier recognized him but couldn't remember him ever saying much. He always paid in exact change, she noted. Every thread of Thomas Grayson's life unraveled into nothing. No doctor visits, no school records, no bank accounts. It was as if he had materialized from thin air. Then came the final twist. The fingerprints from the crime scenes? They weren't just his, they belonged to multiple people. The system couldn't process it. How could one man have multiple sets of fingerprints? Laura consulted with a forensic specialist, who suggested a theory so bizarre she almost laughed. What if he's a chimera? A genetic chimera, one person carrying 2 sets of DNA, possibly absorbed from a twin in the womb. It was rare, but it could explain why his DNA was inconsistent. But that still didn't explain his missing past. Then Laura found something even stranger. An old missing persons case, over 30 years old. A boy, Henry Calloway, had vanished from a foster home at age 6. His case was never solved. Laura had a gut feeling. She sent Thomas's DNA for further testing, cross-referencing it with Henry's family. The results came back. It was a match. Thomas Grayson wasn't Thomas Grayson. He was Henry Calloway, a boy who had disappeared 3 decades ago. But why was he killing now? Laura confronted Thomas with the results. For the first time, his expression changed. He looked amused. "So, you found me," he said. "Who are you?" she pressed. "I am everyone and no one."
Laura leaned forward. "You're Henry Calloway, aren't you?"
He chuckled. "That was one of my names, yes." It was like talking to a ghost. The forensic team found more evidence in the rental house, blood traces beneath the floorboards. The FBI was called in. They reopened Henry Calloway's missing person case and found records from the foster home he had vanished from. There had been reports of abuse.
Children disappearing.
The home was shut down, the records sealed. Had Henry been a victim? Had he run away, only to become something far worse? Laura wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the crimes he had committed, or the fact that he had evaded detection for so long. Even as he awaited trial, Thomas, Henry, never broke character. He never showed remorse. The town of Ashford tried to move on, but people whispered about him. About how a man with no past could blend in so well. One night, Laura sat in her office, staring at his mugshot. Something nagged at her. She pulled up old reports on missing children from the same foster system. Several had vanished in the same year Henry had. One of them, another boy named Ethan, had been found decades later, living under an assumed name. Could Thomas have been one of many? Had he been alone in his crimes? Laura wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The trial came and went. He was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison. But when they went to transfer him to maximum security, his cell was empty.
No sign of a breakout. No security footage.
Just an empty room. As if Thomas Grayson, Henry Calloway, had never been there at all. The prison guards were baffled. The cameras had been rolling all night. No one had entered or exited. And yet, the man they had locked up simply wasn't there anymore. Laura got the call at 3 a.m. She arrived at the prison, heart pounding. She had put away murderers before, but none of them had disappeared into thin air. The warden replayed the security footage over and over. At 2:13 a.m., Thomas had been lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling. At 2:14 a.m., the feed glitched for exactly 2 seconds. When it cleared, the cot was empty. They searched the entire facility. No footprints, no broken locks, no sign of forced entry or exit. It was as if he had ceased to exist. Laura didn't believe in the supernatural, but this case was testing her limits. People didn't just vanish. A few days later, she got a call from a detective in a town 2 states away. He had read about Thomas's escape and wanted to compare notes. He had a case of his own. 3 women, all murdered in their homes. Throats slit with surgical precision. Laura's stomach dropped. The detective sent over a grainy security photo from a nearby gas station. A tall man in a hood, paying in exact change. Laura recognized the posture, the way his fingers rested on the counter. It was him. But Thomas Grayson, Henry Calloway, was supposed to be locked up.
Laura barely slept that night.
She combed through every case file, looking for something she had missed. A pattern. A mistake. Then she saw it. A name that had appeared in the background of every report. A foster care worker named Richard Lee. He had been listed in Henry Calloway's file as a case manager. In Ethan's file, too. And in a dozen other cases of missing children from the same foster home.
Laura dug deeper.
Richard Lee had left the foster system decades ago.
No criminal record, no paper trail.
But his last known address? Just a few miles from where Thomas Grayson had been renting his house.
Laura's pulse quickened.
Could Richard Lee have been involved? Had he helped Henry, Thomas, become what he was? Or worse, was he still helping him? Laura drove out to the address the next morning.
A small, run-down house on the edge of town.
The curtains were drawn.
No car in the driveway. She knocked on the door.
No answer. She was about to leave when she noticed something, a cigarette butt on the porch, still smoldering. Someone had been here. Recently. Laura drew her gun. She turned the doorknob. It wasn't locked. Inside, the house was almost empty, just like Thomas's rental. A mattress on the floor. A chair.
And on the walls, Photos. Dozens of them. Faces of missing children.
Some she recognized from old case files. Others she didn't. In the center of the wall was a single word, written in red ink.
Laura's blood ran cold.
She turned at the sound of a floorboard creaking behind her.
A figure stood in the shadows. Tall. Lean.
A familiar calmness in his posture. And then he smiled. "You always find me, detective." Laura raised her gun, but she already knew this wasn't over. It was never over.
Laura knew she couldn't chase shadows forever.
But she also knew she couldn't walk away. Thomas, Henry, whoever he was, had made it personal. She spent months tracking down every lead, every missing child from the foster system tied to Richard Lee. One by one, she found records of new identities, names that didn't exist before they appeared out of nowhere. She followed the trail across 3 states, speaking with families who had taken in children who ran away years later. But none of them truly remembered the details. It was like these kids had been placed, then plucked from the world without a trace. Then came the letter. It arrived at the precinct with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just 4 words.
"You're getting too close."
Laura's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. That night, she drove home with one hand on her gun. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows.
She barely slept.
A week passed.
No new murders.
No new sightings. It was almost worse than when the killings had started. A security alert on her computer flagged a case in a small town 3 states away. A Jane Doe had been found murdered in her apartment. Throat slit. No forced entry.
Martha Nolan.
The landlord who had rented Thomas Grayson his house. Laura's hands shook as she read the report. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. She stared at the crime scene photos, her heart pounding.
And then she saw it, on the wall, written in blood, just like before. Next.
Laura swallowed hard. She wasn't the detective anymore. She was the prey. Her phone buzzed. A restricted number. She hesitated, then answered.
A voice, calm and familiar.
"You always find me, detective." Click.
Laura exhaled shakily and closed her eyes.
Thomas, or whatever name he had now, was still out there. And he was watching. Laura knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, like, share, and turn on your post notification for more true crime documentary story.